In this task, we're moving nicely on with the basics of embedded systems and fundamental control for microcontrollers. Now, what we're looking at here is we're hoping, well, I suppose at this stage, that you're comfortable now with wiring in some outputs, wiring in some inputs, and declaring them within your code. Here what we're going to do is we're going to try and advance on some of the I/O, so some of the inputs and the outputs. So just a little bit more wiring to set up, and then really delve into the if statement. Okay, so on our setup here, really we've just got 3 LEDs, and then we've got 3 switches, but we're just using 2 of them. So you'll see when we put one switch on and the other one is off, we have the orange, it's flashing. Then if we put both our switches on, you'll see the red is flashing. And then if we take the other one off, so switch 1 off and switch 2 on, that will leave us with the green LED flashing, and if both of them are off, we're left with nothing happening. Okay, so 2 switches of the 3 wired in, and if I just, maybe if I just pause it back at a nicer area. When you have 2 switches, remember you have 4 possible scenarios. Both switches on, both switches off, switch 1 on, switch 2 off, and then switch 2 on and switch 1 off. So 4 combinations there, and that's what you have to assess. You have to tell the microcontroller what it has to do for all those scenarios. And we're essentially going to do multiple if statements to control that. Okay, and we've just got a different series of output for each of them. Okay, so the setup, hopefully not too bad. Again, remember wiring the inputs, when wiring the inputs, we take power into the input and then take the signal into the MBED, and then for the output, where the MBED's giving out the signal and then we're grounding it, and remember to keep your LEDs polarized. Okay, so that's what we've got that there. That's this is the pictorial representation of it. Again, just to see the layout that a little bit clearer. We're just using 2 switches. I know the one I have is a 3 switch setup, but we're just using 2 of them. Again, don't forget about the schematic. Get comfortable with it. Notice you see all these legs are getting tied into ground. That actually should be a heavy dot there, like that is. So that's just a wee mistake. Notice that both these are being tied into voltage out. You could have just drew a straight line down here and tied it in there. And then we've got 2 separate pins, pin 20 and pin 19 are taking the inputs, and then still 14, 12, and 10 are the pins for the LEDs. Okay, so as always, be comfortable with the setup. Maybe try and understand this first, and then maybe rely on the pictorial thing just to get it over the line. Now really there's nothing too new there in the hardware and the setup. Okay, what's new is in the code. Okay, and this is where we really start to develop on with our if statements. Okay, so let's just, we'll do a little bit of highlighting here. Let's put color. Yeah, that should be alright. Now, something that we're introducing here, which is really important in coding and something we want to see a lot more of, is comments. Okay, so when you use this double /, anything you type in, basically the compiler ignores it. So it allows you to type some text in and to give some explanations about what else is going on in the system. So you'll see here I've just said hardware declarations, because remember at the start, before our main code, we've got to do our hardware declarations. So our digital outs for all our LEDs and our digital in for the switches. So it's nice just to put that comment there, so again it refreshes our memory of what's happening. Down here we can see start of main loop. So again, that just lets me tells me that everything I include down here is within my main loop. Okay, I could have said up here, we could have done import the embed library. So I've just put in a couple of comments, and what we like to see, not that you have to do a comment for every single line, but you want your code to be nicely commented, because when you leave the code and then come back to it, it refreshes your memory that quicker and lets you know what's going on. So you could have put a little comment in here that just says turn an LED on, and then you could put this one here, turn an LED off. You wouldn't need to do it for every single one of them because we know that's just the same thing being repeated. So start using the comments. That's something that we'll be looking for as we go along. So let's just rub out some of this here. So everything should be fairly covered and hopefully familiar with at this moment in time. Remember, we've got our while loop, our infinite loop that is going on in here. And then what we've got is we've got 4 if statements, really, okay? But we have an if, else if, else if, else. Okay, so remember you always have if and else, and then if you wanted to put in another one, you do an else if, okay? So it's what's called nested if statements or embedded if statements, okay? So remember what we said, we have 2 switches, so we have 4 combinations. So here's the first one, there's the second one, there's the third one, and then we have the 4th one down here. So it's important you cover all scenarios. If you had more switches, you would have more combinations that you need to cover. It's in order to keep your system fully defined. Okay? So when you're doing this, you have your if statement, and then you're saying, okay, what are the inputs? Because essentially the question you're asking is, if these inputs are in a particular combination, what do we do? All right? So we'll just rub some of this out. Again, just to not crowd the scenario. So we're doing our logical comparisons. We're saying if this one's on and this one's on. So literally saying if both switches are active, this is what we're going to do. And again, notice the brackets, that's sort of grouping this bit of code together. Red LED is on, wait 0.2 of a second, turn all off and let it loop around. Okay. So if the controller doesn't see those switches in that scenario, it'll ignore this, and then it will check down here. So is switch 2 on and switch 1 off? Then it will do this bit of code in which it turns the green on and it makes sure everything else is off. Again, if that is impossible, it will ignore this code and it will check the next scenario. So is switch 1 on now and switch 2 off? If it is, it will do this code, which puts the amber on and everything else off. If that still isn't the case, it will ignore that, and then it does the else. Now remember, with the else, we don't need to put anything in here because it can work out, since there's only 2 inputs and we've figured out everything else, this is the only thing that's left. So you don't have to put that in. So it knows, because we've done switch 1 on, switch 2 on, then this one off, this one on, this one on, this one off, it'll know that the last scenario is both off, and we're just saying keep everything off. Okay, so hopefully that's making sense. Remember, with these switches, these are dip switches, they're staying pressed on. So because this is doing it so quickly and it's looping around everything, if both switches are on, it'll do this line of code. It ignores everything else, and then it goes and it loops back around, loops all the way back around, and it'll check again, are them 2 switches still pressed in? Yet they are, because they're mechanically held in. So it will keep turning on that red LED, then turn it off, and then looping back around, turn it on and turn it off until we move it out of position. So remember the kind of difference there between the spring return push button and these mechanically held in switches. These detent switches can have an impact on our code. Okay. Also, just some other common mistakes that people do is sometimes they might not. Let me just again try and make it a little bit clearer here. Sometimes when they're doing their code, they might forget, okay, I put the green one on, but then they forget to turn everything off. And that can be an issue because, let's try and make it as clear as possible. If I took out that bit of code, put out this, some people tend to say, right, If those switches are on, just put the red on. If this combination is on, just put the green on. If this combination, just put the amber on. If you forget to turn everything else off, what happens is, as you change your switches, if the red LED was on, you haven't turned it off somewhere else. So if you actually did this combination, the red was on, and then you did this combination of inputs, the green would come on, but the red would stay on too, because it hasn't been turned off. Okay. So, you know, it could even still happen in this code that depending on the time we switch the outputs, or the inputs, sorry, the other ones may still be held on. So it's just a couple of things to think about. You know, what would be maybe more correct is in here, you say red on, and again you would list out green LED off, amber LED off, and then wait 0.2 seconds, and then red, green, amber off. Okay, so again you could, to really properly define your code, you could have them extra bits in at the start. So hopefully that's clear, it's making sense. A few things to play around with, okay? Try out a different combinations, see what way it works. If you have some push buttons at home, maybe try and wire them in and see how that impacts the code. Big thing here is how we're doing multiple if statements, being able to write them out and being comfortable at writing those out and knowing how to bracket them, putting the brackets in, maybe spacing them out and indenting them across helps lay it out a bit better. So get used to that, because really if you think about so many systems, so many machines, it's always if something happens do this, oh well if something else happens do this, and so on. It's really the if statements are the fundamental building blocks of coding, so do try and get comfortable with them as soon as possible.